She gave her daughter away for nothing, to a stranger on the doorstep, with nothing in his pockets and nothing in his stomach, and the girl shouldered a bag and walked off down the street and never came back. And the part nobody on that whole block saw coming is that it saved him, and it saved her right along with him. The house on Hawthorne Lane was the kind people slowed their cars down to look at creamy white paint. A porch with a row of clay pots full of red geraniums, the deep velvet red kind, watered so faithfully they kept their colour long after the first frost should have taken them. A doormat by the steps that still reads "So glad you're here" in friendly little letters, even though nobody behind that door had felt anything close to glad in years. Strangers driving by would glance over and think, somebody peaceful lives there. Somebody loved. They had no idea. Because inside that pretty white house, behind the clean windows and the bright little flowers, lived a 22-year-old woman named Nia, and Nia had not felt peaceful or loved in a very long time. Nia had her mother's eyes, dark, warm, the kind that swept across a whole room in one glance and kept every detail of it tucked away for later. She wore her hair pulled back the same way every morning, not because she liked it that way, but because there were never enough minutes in her day to do anything else with it. She owned a handful of shirts that still fit, and she rotated through them, washing one in the bathroom sink while she wore the next. She woke at 5:45 every single morning with no alarm, because her body had learned the hard way that her stepmother, Marlene, wanted the kitchen warm and breakfast on the table by 6, and Marlene did not care to wait. Nia's real mother had died when Nia was 7 years old. Her father, a gentle man who built cabinets and bookshelves for a living and hummed old hymns while he worked, with a pencil always tucked behind his ear, remarried 2 years after that. And for a little while, things were almost okay. Almost. Then her father got sick, the slow kind of sick, the kind that empties a house out one quiet month at a time. And then her father was gone too. And after the funeral, after the foil pans of food stopped arriving and the last cousin pulled out of the driveway and the house dropped into that thick, ringing silence, Marlene sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Nia for a long, long time, not with grief, with arithmetic, like she was adding up a column of figures and didn't like where it landed. That was 4 years ago. Since then, Nia had become something Marlene would never have said out loud to a neighbour, but said constantly in the way she sighed, in the way she handed over lists, in the way she looked clean through her like she was a streak on the glass, a burden. That was the word living underneath all of it. Nia cooked every meal. Nia scrubbed every floor. Nia ran to the store, to the pharmacy, to the post office, and back to the store again because Marlene had left one thing off the list on purpose just to send her out a second time. She had a college degree, a real one, paper and a seal, and her own name printed clean across the front of it, sitting in a folder under the sweaters in her bottom drawer. And Marlene had never once asked her a single thing about it. Nia had applied for 4 jobs the spring before. 2 of them had written back. Marlene had lifted those envelopes out of the mailbox and dropped them in the trash before Nia ever saw them. Nia didn't know that yet. But she was about to learn something a great deal worse, and she was going to learn it on an ordinary grey Tuesday afternoon. It was late October. The sky outside was the colour of an old coin, flat and low, the kind of sky that makes the whole world feel like it's holding its breath. Marlene was stretched out on the couch with a blanket over her knees, watching one of those home makeover shows with the volume turned up too loud. Nia was in the kitchen, pressing a damp cloth to a fresh red line on her wrist where the oven rack had bitten her, when she heard it. 3 slow knocks on the front door, and then a voice. Low, a little rough at the edges, tired in a way that went deeper than one bad night. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. Anything you could spare, I'd be grateful for." Marlene muted the television. She set the blanket aside, stood up slowly, smoothed her blouse down with both hands, and walked to the door wearing the particular little smile she always wore, right before she enjoyed herself at someone else's expense. She opened it. The man on the porch was young, maybe 27, 28, tall, but thinned down in the way people get when meals have turned into something they hope for instead of something they can count on. His coat hung off his shoulders, like it had been cut for a bigger man, or for a version of himself that used to carry more. The sole of his left shoe had peeled loose, and he'd bound it shut with a wrap of tape. But his eyes didn't match the rest of him. They were steady, calm, not pleading, not broken, just patient, like a man who had learned to wait on things and not expect much. His name was Seo-jun. He'd come over from Korea with his parents when he was a small boy, and he'd buried both of them before he turned 23, and he'd been sleeping wherever the night allowed for almost 3 years. Marlene looked him up and down the way she'd look at a spider she'd found behind the toilet. "You're young," she said. "Why aren't you working?" "I'm trying, ma'am," he said. "It's hard to get hired when you can't write an address on the form." Marlene made a small sound through her nose that wasn't quite a laugh. Then she turned her head and called back into the house. "Nia, come here." Nia came out of the kitchen, still drying her hands on a dish towel. She stopped when she saw the man on the porch. He looked back at her. And something passed between them in that half a second. Something quiet and without a name. The recognition two people share when they've both been left out in the cold by the very people who were supposed to keep them warm. Neither of them said a word. "Get him some water," Marlene said. Nia filled a glass and carried it out to him. He took it with both hands, carefully, like it might shatter, like kindness was a thing he'd learned to hold gently because it didn't come his way too often. "Thank you," he said. And he said it to her. Not to Marlene. To Nia. She nodded and turned to step back inside. And that's when Marlene said it. Light. Easy. The way you'd decide what to put on a sandwich. "Take her." Seo-jun blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Her." Marlene lifted one hand and pointed it at Nia. "Take her with you. She's yours now. Call it charity." The dish towel slipped out of Nia's fingers and dropped to the floor. She turned and looked at her stepmother and waited for the part where the joke landed, where Marlene rolled her eyes, and said she was only kidding. That part never came. "She's grown," Marlene said, her voice perfectly flat. "She eats my food. She runs up my water bill. I have carried this girl 4 years and I am finished carrying her. You came to my door asking for something? There it is. Take it." I can't," Seo-jun said, shaking his head slowly. "Mom, I don't even have a roof over my head. I've got nothing to offer anyone." "Not my concern," Marlene said. And then she looked at Nia. And Nia saw it, finally, fully, with nothing left in front of it. Not anger, not guilt, not even the smallest flicker of shame. Nothing. At all. 4 years of nothing, finally pulling off its mask and showing her its real face, and somehow that was worse than if Marlene had stood there and screamed. Nia walked down the hall to her room. She stood in the doorway a moment and let her eyes move over all of it, the narrow bed. The blanket folded at the foot of it, the soft one her mother had knitted by hand the winter before she got sick. The little stack of library books on the floor that Nia read at night to remind herself she still had an inside life. The framed photo of her father on the nightstand, grinning, a dusting of sawdust still caught in his hair. She picked the photo up, held it a second, then set it back down, exactly where it had been, and pulled her backpack out from under the bed. 3 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, the folder with her degree in it, the knitted blanket, jammed in, even though it barely fit, the zipper straining at the teeth, and 1 book, just 1. Charlotte's Web, soft and creased, the one her mother used to read to her at night in a low voice, doing all the different animals. She zipped the bag shut, slung it over one shoulder, and walked back out. Seo-jun was still on the porch, frozen, looking like a man who wasn't sure the ground under him was real. Nia stepped past him, down the 2 porch steps, past her own geraniums, and started walking toward the end of the driveway without looking back. After a moment, she heard his footsteps fall in behind her. And behind both of them, the front door of the house on Hawthorne Lane swung shut, and the deadbolt turned over with a small final click. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes. They walked side by side down the lane, past the matching houses with their matching lawns, past the mailboxes shaped like little barns, until the sidewalk turned older and rougher, and the neighborhood started to thin out into something less polished. Finally, Seo-jun cleared his throat. "You didn't have to come with me," he said. "You know that." "I know." "You could go back. You could tell somebody what she just did. Somebody would step in. A neighbor, a church. Somebody. Nia watched a crack in the pavement slide past under her shoes. She's been doing this to me for 4 years, she said quietly. Nobody stepped in then. Why would they start tonight? Seo-jun didn't have an answer for that, so he just kept walking beside her, and the silence between them stopped feeling so heavy. Now look, before we go any further into this, if this story is already pulling you in, do me one small favor and tap that subscribe button. Stories like this one take a long time to put together, and the only way I know you want more of them is when you tell me. All right. Back to the lane, and the grey sky, and the two of them walking toward whatever came next. By the time the last of the lights started leaking out of the sky, they'd reached the edge of the old downtown, the part of the city most people only ever see through a car window with the doors locked. A shuttered bus depot with weeds shoving up through the cracks. A laundromat with newspaper taped over the glass. A parking garage with half its lights burned out. Seo-jun stopped at the mouth of the garage. "Third floor," he said. "It stays dry up there, warmer than the street, and the wind can't reach you. I've used it before." Nia nodded like this was the most ordinary thing in the world. They climbed the concrete stairs and found a corner behind a thick support column. Seo-jun had a sleeping bag rolled tight and lashed to the bottom of his pack. He held it out to her. She started to refuse. He shook his head once, just once, and lowered himself down with his back against the column and his too big coat pulled tight across his chest, and that was the end of the argument. For a while they just sat in the dark and listened to the city breathe down below them. Somewhere far off, a car door slammed. A pigeon shifted its feet on a steel beam over their heads. "Before she got like that," Seo-jun said into the dark, "what was it like? Was there ever a good version of her?" Nia thought about it a long time. "I don't think there was a before," she finally said. "I think I just kept telling myself I had her wrong, that I was being unfair, that she'd warm up eventually if I just did a little more." She paused. "I did a lot more. It never came." Seo-jun nodded slowly, though she could barely make him out. "I used to do that too," he said. "With who?" "My aunt. She took me in after my parents passed. I told myself, fine, at least I'm not alone. At least I've got somebody. Then one afternoon I came home from looking for work and the locks had been changed, and everything I owned was sitting out on the curb in 2 garbage bags." He shrugged. And she heard the fabric of his coat move against the concrete. "I waited on that curb 3 hours. She never once came to the window. The quiet settled over them again, soft, not awkward this time." "Why that street?" Nia asked after a while. "Why our street? Why our door?" No real reason," he said. "I just keep walking until I find somewhere that doesn't feel like it wants to push me back into the road." He was quiet a second. "Your porch had flowers on it. Geraniums, I think. Somebody had been keeping them alive. I figured a house with somebody who tends flowers like that might have somebody kind inside it." A short, dry laugh. "I was half right." Nia let out a breath that turned, almost against her will, into something close to a laugh. It came out cracked and unfamiliar because she honestly couldn't remember the last time she'd done it. "I planted those," she said. "I know," Seo-jun said simply. "Nobody who hated living in that house plants flowers out front for strangers to enjoy." She looked at him in the dark for a long moment. Then she reached into her backpack, pulled out her mother's blanket, and threw half of it across his lap. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just drew it a little higher and let his eyes fall shut. The next morning, Nia was already awake when a thin grey light began seeping in through the open sides of the structure. Seo-jun was still asleep, chin dropped to his chest. She sat with her knees pulled up against the cold and watched the city come slowly to life beneath her, the first delivery trucks, the first joggers, the first lights flicking on in apartment windows. And her mind, the mind that never really shut off, was already moving. She thought about the things he'd told her the night before, half asleep, scrubbing dishes in the back of a diner for cash, hauling crates off trucks before sunup, patching a man's roof once, a whole day of work in the sun, and then being told to clear off when the job was done with not $1 in his hand. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't broken the way she'd assumed a man begging on a porch would be broken. He was just somebody who'd been dropped by every single person who was ever supposed to catch him. "I know exactly how that feels," she thought. and by the time Seo-jun blinked awake and rubbed the cold out of his face, Nia already had a plan. "There's a distribution warehouse over on Hargrove Street," she said. "I've walked past it 100 times. They've always got the same sign taped up in the window. Day labor, cash daily, no experience required." Seo-jun shook his head before she'd even finished. "They'll take one look at me and say no." "Look at me. You've got steady hands," Nia said, "and you show up. That's already more than half the people they hire can say for themselves." He stared at her like she was speaking a language nobody had ever bothered to teach him, but he got up and he followed her, and they went. The man doing the hiring was a thick, gruff guy named Gus with a coffee stain on his shirt and not 1 ounce of patience for anybody's life story. He took one look at Seo-jun's taped shoe and started shaking his head before he'd even finished walking over. Nia stepped right into his path. "3 days," she said. "Just give him 3 days. If he isn't the best worker on your floor by Friday, I'll write you an apology and you'll never see either one of us again." Gus squinted at her. "And who are you?" "Exactly. I'm the person making sure you don't lose out on the most reliable man who's going to walk through that gate all year." Gus held her stare for a long beat. Then he jabbed a thumb towards Seo-jun. "3 days. Be here when the gate goes up at 6. You're late once, you're done." Outside in the cold, Seo-jun stopped walking. "Why are you doing all this for me? You don't owe me anything. You met me yesterday." Nia kept moving toward the corner. "Because somebody should have done it for me," she said. "And nobody ever did." He stood there a second longer. Then he caught up. 3 days became a week. The week became a month. Seo-jun was at that gate every single morning before it opened, sometimes a full half-hour early, blowing on his hands in the dark. He learned every aisle of that warehouse. He lifted, he sorted, he counted, he stacked, he swept. When the other guys cut corners, he didn't. When Gus needed somebody to stay 2 hours past the whistle, and nobody else would raise a hand, Seo-jun's hand went up. And at night, the two of them built something else entirely. They pooled every dollar they had between them, her little stash of savings from odd jobs scraped together over the years, his first crumpled paychecks, and they rented a single room above a shoe repair shop on Dover Street. It was so small you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out wide. The radiator made a sound like a wounded animal in the night. The only window faced a brick wall 4 feet away. They loved it more than any place either of them had ever lived. At night, by the light of one lamp, Nia spread sheets of notebook paper across the floor and helped Seo-jun read. He could read a little already, but slowly, haltingly, sounding the words out under his breath, and he'd carried the quiet shame of that his whole life. She never rushed him. She never sighed. She never once made him feel small for it. He sat with the tip of his tongue between his teeth, working through one word at a time, and when he finally cracked a hard one, he'd look up at her with this big, unguarded grin, like a kid who'd just balanced on a bike for the first time. And she'd look back at him like she was watching something that had been there all along, just buried under years of nobody bothering to look. One night he was practicing writing out his own name. His handwriting came out shaky, the letters too big, all of them leaning into each other, like they might topple over. He stared down at the page and muttered, "Looks stupid." "It looks like a man who's learning," Nia said, "which beats a man who quit." He was quiet a moment. Then, without looking up, he said, "Nobody ever sat down with me like this before. Not once. My whole life." She didn't say anything back. She just pressed the pencil gently back into his hand and pointed at the next word on the page. But her throat had gone tight, and she had to turn her face toward the brick wall window so he wouldn't catch what was sitting in her eyes. 2 months in, Gus pulled Seo-jun aside and made him a floor supervisor. Seo-jun came home that night and just stood in the doorway, not moving. Nia looked up from her book. He opened his mouth and his voice came out rough. He said, "I'm the most dependable man he's hired in 6 years. She stood up. He was fighting to hold himself together and losing. His jaw was working. His eyes were wet and bright in the lamplight. She crossed that tiny room in 3 steps and put her arms around him, not gently, not carefully, but hard, the way you hold on to something to make sure it's really there. He held on just as tight. Down on the street, somebody leaned on a horn. A train rumbled past a few blocks off. The radiator clanked once and went still. Neither of them let go for a long, long time. Now, back on Hawthorne Lane, Marlene's careful little life was quietly coming apart at the seams. Neighborhoods have long memories, and people talk. The woman who gave her stepdaughter away to a homeless man right there on her own front porch. The story traveled house to house, bending a little with each retelling, but the heart of it never changed. Marlene stopped getting invited to things. Women she'd known for 15 years suddenly found something fascinating on their phones whenever they passed her on the sidewalk. Her garden club dropped her from the group chat without a single word of explanation. She told herself she didn't care. She cared more than she could stand. And then the money turned on her. There had been a loan, taken out a couple of years back against the value of the house, secured with paperwork she hadn't entirely had the right to sign in the first place. The man who'd lent it, a slick character named Rocco who wore far too much cologne and smiled with his eyes shut, started calling twice a day. Then he started showing up in person. Then, one Thursday morning, he showed up with another man, a quiet one in a grey suit holding a leather folder. Marlene opened the door and immediately tried to shut it again. The man in the suit raised up a single sheet of paper. "Ma'am," he said, "the county has filed an interest against this property. I'm going to need you to step outside." By the time Nia and Seojun happened to drive down Hawthorne Lane that afternoon, it was nearly finished. They weren't there for any of it. They had no idea it was even happening. They'd only come back to pick up a box of Nia's old things she'd remembered leaving in the hall closet years ago, books and a few photos, that a kind neighbour named Miss Carroll, the one who'd always kept a spare key, had finally called her about. They turned onto the street and saw the cars parked at odd angles, the men in suits, the clipboards, the neighbours out on their porches with their arms folded, watching. And there, in the middle of all of it, stood Marlene. Smaller than Nia remembered her. Smaller than she'd ever looked from inside that house. Standing in her own driveway with her arms crossed tight over her chest, her eyes darting from face to face, finding not one single person willing to walk over and stand beside her. Seojun eased off the gas and pulled to the curb. They sat there. Nia watched her stepmother for a long moment. She watched Marlene finally turn and notice the car, and then notice the face in the passenger window and recognize it. Marlene started walking toward them. She walked like each step was costing her something. Her chin was lifted, but her hands were shaking at her sides. Nia opened the door and got out. They stood 3 feet apart on the same cracked sidewalk they used to share. Nia. Marlene's voice had a fracture running clean through it. "I need help. I don't have anyone left." "You had me," Nia said. Not loud, not cruel, just true. Marlene's chin dropped a little. "I know." "You gave me away," Nia said. "To a stranger, off the porch, like a bag of clothes you'd stopped wanting, because you decided I wasn't worth the trouble of keeping." Marlene was crying now, small, tight tears, the kind that only come when a person finally understands they've thrown away something they can never get back. Nia let the silence sit between them a moment. Then she turned to the nearest man holding a folder. "Do whatever the law says you have to do," she said quietly. "But please do it with some dignity." The man nodded. Nia got back in the car and shut the door. Seojun looked over at her. He didn't say anything. She stared straight out the windshield, her hands perfectly still in her lap, her face calm, but her jaw was tight, and he could see the muscle in it working. So he reached over and laid his hand over both of hers. She took one slow breath, in and out. Then he put the car in gear, and they drove away, and they didn't look in the mirror. 8 months later, on a bright Saturday in October, they got married. Just a courthouse ceremony. Miss Carroll stood as the witness. A clerk who genuinely seemed glad for them said, "Congratulations," like she meant it. And Nia carried a small bunch of yellow and white flowers she'd bought from a bucket outside a corner store, still half wrapped in their plastic sleeve. Afterward, they stood together on the courthouse steps in the warm autumn light, and Seojun looked at her like he still couldn't quite believe she was standing there, and she looked at him like she had finally, at exactly the right moment, stopped being surprised by good things. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin silver bracelet with a small engraved plate on it. He turned it so she could read it. "You were always worth keeping," He'd had it made at a little shop on Dover Street. The woman behind the counter had asked him what he wanted it to say, and he'd stood there silent for a long time, turning it over in his head, before he finally told her those 4 words. Nia pressed her lips together hard. She held out her wrist and let him fasten it on. "You know what I think about sometimes?" she said, her voice low. "What?" She thought she was getting rid of a burden that day. Nia looked down at the bracelet catching the light, and all she actually did was set me free. Seojun nodded slowly. "She threw away the best thing she ever had," he said. "That's not your weight to carry." Below them, the whole city kept right on moving. Buses and bikes and strangers heading everywhere all at once. 2 people who had been left behind by everyone who was ever supposed to stay, standing there in the October sun, still here, still standing, finally home. The woman who gave her away is still paying for everything she lost. The girl she gave away stopped counting her losses a long, long time ago. And the homeless man nobody would let through their door turned out to be the only person in her whole life who ever opened one and actually meant it. If this story moved you even a little, do me a favor before you go. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what you would have done if you were Nia, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I read every single comment, and the next story is one you are not going to want to scroll past. I'll see you in the next video.